Great. In order to facilitate time for input, feedback, and discussion, we're going to keep our introductions short and sweet, but we have put bios of all the presenters on the homepage, and I think Sam is going to put that link in the chat. Our first speaker is Andy Crowe, who is going to tell us about visualizing Pulter's emblems, approaching poetics through graphic narrative. Andy?
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and hopefully this will all go smoothly. Okay. You can see my messy desktop too. All right, there we go. So today I'm going to talk you through an assignment that I developed that puts the Pulter Project to use outside of the early modern classroom. The short of this assignment is I had my students turn Pulter's emblem poems into poetry comics. So these examples, oh, can I get this to turn? Okay, so these examples and also the one on the first slide are all from adaptations of Pulter's The Porcupine, which was a class favorite. In my 10 minutes today, I want to walk you through the aims and theory guiding the assignment and talk to you about what my students did with it and show you what they did with it also. My hope is that you might find this assignment useful enough to adapt for yourself, that you might help me think of other ways to further develop and refine it, and that it might open up some new avenues for thinking about what Pulter does in our discussion today as well. I assigned this project last spring, just nuts and bolts here. It was for a class called Studies in Poetry, which is a course required for all English majors at Boston College. It's mainly sophomore students who are interested in becoming English majors. And the aim of the course is to teach students how to read poetry, to expose them to a diverse range of poems from different historical time periods, and also to get them to think a little bit about poetics as well. And one of my personal goals was that I really wanted each student to develop a working theory of what poetry is, a theory of their own that they had worked out through firsthand observation, analysis, and experimentation. Many students, in fact, all but one of my students coming into the class in the semester think that they don't like poetry. On the first day I asked how many like poetry, and one student raised their hand. And that actually changed by the end of the semester, so that was nice. But many students think they don't like poetry because they've encountered it as a list of arcane terms to be memorized. Oops. Oh no. The Zoom share. Okay. Are we good? Is it still showing? Yes, sweet. Okay. So many students think they don't like poetry because they've encountered it as a list of arcane terms to be memorized that often seem to bear no relation to making sense of poems themselves. My aim was to get my students to move away from trying to apply preformed concepts and instead genuinely interrogate the effects of the poetic features they encountered. So this Pulter Comics assignment was one way of trying to get them into that headspace. The assignment essentially asks students to do ekphrasis in reverse, looking closely and slowly, as per our conversations on day one of this conference, at the formal features of Pulter's emblems and making sense of what they do by determining how to translate those features into a visual form. So I was asking them to do something really abstract, but I wanted them to get abstract, to interrogate what a line break does, what assonance is, what organizational work strophes do, by extracting their essence and transmuting that essence into another medium, sort of some Pulter style alchemy. So this assignment was also built on two other topics we'd been discussing in the semester. First of all, we'd been talking a lot about poetry as a visual medium. And second, we've been talking about the social life of poetry. So regarding this first part about poetry as a visual medium, oh, come on. How do I get you to change? There we go. We had discussed how a defining feature of a lot of poetry is how it looks. You can often spot a poem because its shape isn't solely determined by the shape of the page. And then we had looked at works that specifically engage with poetry's visual side, such as Robert Herrick's shape poems, William Blake's illuminated verse, Susan Howe's concrete poetry, Bianca Stone's comics poems, and of course the Emblem book tradition, which Pulter participates in. As we turn to Pulter, the access that the Pulter Project provided to easily view her manuscript alongside the edited poems gave students another context in which to consider the visual dimensions of poetry, in this case by looking at the care and sort of style put into the writing itself. And then secondly, regarding the social life of poetry, that other big topic that I was dovetailing into this assignment, we had spent a lot of the class talking about how poems circulate. So why do people make them and what do they want them to do? The idea here was to get students past thinking of poems as inscrutable art objects to be admired from a respectful distance, and to instead see writing a poem as a means of acting on the world. Using the Pulter Project, which as you can see from the little bits I've pulled here, really highlights the collaborative and creative nature of its own ever in process production, helped us think about how poetry acts on the world, not only of the poet who creates it, Pulter participating in royalist literary networks, for example, but also how later readers return to those works with new concerns and turn those poems to new ends, like the editors who put together this project and continue to. Okay, so turning now to the assignment itself and how it played out. So students got into groups and picked which emblem poem they wanted to work with. And I gave them a worksheet with this set of questions to guide their comics making. The questions ask students to think about the parts of the poem in relation to the parts of their comic. How to turn sections defined by line and strophe breaks into visual spatial arrangements. How to convey sound and tone through drawn design. How to replicate a poem's use of aural methods of emphasis in visual form. How to demonstrate regularity and breaks with regularity. How to position different ideas in relation to each other. How to incorporate the speaker, and so on. So nuts and bolts again, we spent the first day of the assignment looking at Pulter's poems and kind of talking over ideas and planning. And then the students made their comics outside of class time. And then I believe it was 2 weeks later, we came back and had a second day where they presented their work. Okay, so yeah, and now I'm gonna show you it. So I'm going to run briefly through, these are just a few examples of things they did. None of these are the comics in full, these are just pieces of them. It's kind of a lot of material. So here, in this rendition, this group covered the cuckoo, and they chose to convey Pulter's couplet form by formatting each page of their comic as a pair of balanced panels. So 2 sort of even panels on every page of the comic. And then here you can see at the bottom where Pulter's down there writing at her desk. The students, so in the last 6 lines of this poem, Pulter turns, as she so often does, to cry out to God about her desire for escape. And the students saw her poetic production as a means by which she tries to achieve this transcendence. And so this is what they're trying to draw out in this final panel here by turning away from the more literal rendition of what's happening in the poem to showing her at her table writing. In this version of the Porcupine, the students used imbalance to convey an aspect of Pulter's rhyme. So the lines quoted by the Porcupine on the right are the only instance of a 3-line rhyme in what is otherwise a poem made up entirely of couplets. So they replicated this break with the rhyme scheme and the unbalancing effect it had on the poem by putting additional weight on these lines through giving this panel more space on the page. These students, this is one of my favorites, who worked with scorned Medea, were interested in how this poem is both tightly narratively driven, really packed with story, and then yet really chaotic, telling this very violent story and taking sudden unexpected turns. If you look at the page on the left, they conveyed Pulter's rapid description of Medea's discovery of Jason's unfaithfulness, her murder of her children, by packing this sequence really tightly in on the page. And so they both wanted to draw attention to the narrative drive by dividing it up into panels, but then they wanted to also make the panels irregular and loose in order to suggest the disorder that drives the story. And then if you look at that second page there, they were also interested in this turn Pulter suddenly makes at the end of the poem, where she pulls back from the story of Medea, she goes from the story of Ariadne, and then right at the end, suddenly she her speaker turns away from these successful stories of facing off with enemies to then lament that she can't do the same because, quote, "Oh, my enemies within me be, then from myself, dear God, deliver me." So the students decide to shift from color to black and white here to indicate how much the readers brought up short with this kind of surprise ending. And then finally, in this rendition of The Stately Unicorn, the students decided to portray the irregularities that Pulter inserts into a largely metrically regular poem by showing figures stretched across multiple panels, broken up by panel breaks. So if you look, it's a little bit like complicated, but basically if you look at the unicorn here, who is broken up into two panels, but it's one continuous image, and the same here with this woman. These are set up in reference to lines that add an additional beat to the meter. So who stirs the poisonous waters with his horn, and thus he that scorned his potentest enemy. So they were seeing how to kind of replicate metrical irregularity in visual form. That was their approach. And then on this second page here, so they were really interested in the fact that Pulter repeats this same rhyme, above and love, just a few lines apart. So there's a line that's a couplet that's, so Samson, though enabled from above, found death and ruin from his wanton love. And then 2 lines later, we have, so Solomon, allured by various love, did leave the true and glorious God above. So they decided to draw out these 2 words and then repeat the same images across both panels to indicate that symmetry. And then also, in order to draw out what they saw to be in this poem, Pulter's implicit warning against real world rulers liable to fall, they added this final image here at the bottom with the people looking at the broken crown. And they put no border around that to kind of signify that this is like a subtly present underlying idea, rather than something that's explicitly part of the story, the way the parts that are in panels are. Okay, so thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and the rest of what the panelists have to say.
Thanks so much, Andy. We're going to go slightly out of order here, and we're going to skip down to Diane Mitchell next, whose talk is entitled Into the Pulterverse.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm really pleased to get to go after Andy because I think that their introduction to a poetry class really nicely sets up the possibility that I just want to very briefly explore here of what it looks like to teach with the Pulter Project in just the intro to the English major class. Just your basic skills course that all English majors at my university have to take. Now, of course, maybe some of you work in departments where there's very clear outlines for what the department thinks essential skills for an English major are. I happen to work in a department that hasn't really made that explicit anywhere. So I decided that for me, an essential skill has been being able to engage with old texts, remediate them, and make them accessible to other people. So I thought, why not assume that that could also be an essential skill for my students? And so I'm just going to talk to you for the first part of this about situating a Pulter assignment into the poetry unit of my intro to the major course called literary analysis. So here was the challenge that I gave my students. They had to edit and curate, in the Pulter Project sense, a Hester Pulter poem that had not been edited and published in the Pulter Project. So was not one that they could rely on the transcription for. And I should say here that Wendy and Leah were kind enough to give me access to images of all of the manuscript pages in order for me to download the relevant ones and complete this. I do think that if the Pulter Project had placeholder manuscript images, even when poems haven't been edited, I obviously would not have had to make them do this work for me, but that was very kind of them and allowed us to do this work. So basically, those of you who are familiar with the Pulter Project will know that when I was doing this assignment in the fall of 2019, my first semester teaching at the University of Colorado, it was pretty much just emblems that hadn't been edited. So again, Andy set me up really nicely here. I was a little nervous about having them edit emblems because I think that there is quite a lot of intellectual and generic distance between us and the idea of the emblem. But at the same time, I thought that might be a cool opportunity to give students a sense of ownership over material that felt quite foreign. So I asked them to pick one of these emblems up on the screen. And we practiced, talking about emblems, transcribing emblems together, talking about what kind of edits we would make in class. So this is, of course, Scorned Medea, which is, we use these images in class and had a really lively conversation about what different, how to read the handwriting, right? What changes we would make as editors of this text. So I should say that I really kind of scaffolded the bejesus out of this assignment to try to make it seem not too scary to a lot of students, especially freshmen and sophomores. So they had 8 kind of short homework exercises over the course of 3 weeks. And you can see that they introduced students to using the Pulter Project site, amplified versus elemental editions, using different library research tools, trying to figure out what to gloss and curate. So we did this kind of step by step. And I'll just show you, and just in case anyone wants to screenshot this, I've been doing a lot of screenshotting. This is the first of those little scaffolding exercises that we did that just really asked them to play around with the Pulter Project site. And I love that conversation we were having last time where Jessica Rosenberg was encouraging us to think about what it might mean to spend time with a poem. And I was really trying to get them to spend time with the project here. And I'll just show you what it looked like very briefly when they actually went through all of these steps, some of them in partnerships, and transcribed, edited, and curated an emblem in the style of the Pulter Project. So this is into the Pulterverse. I was really lucky that there's a new initiative at my university to help professors use digital tools in their classes. I would not have been able to do this WordPress assignment without the help of my colleagues through the library. And you can see that they produced a really nice looking kind of class edition of some poems that weren't up on the Pulter Project. So I'll show you just very briefly a couple of them. This is Vain Herostratus. Love this image. I think it's really engaging. And you can see that the 2 students who edited this used that hypothesis plugin that we mentioned last time to kind of annotate difficult words and terms. And they had used different library tools they'd never used before to find out relevant background information to gloss things like, for instance, Ephesus and whatnot. So they did a really nice job here. And then they introduced some little curations. So these 2 were interested in Balthazar's feast. They gave us some information about that and curated a quote from the King James Bible that depicts that. Another topic was mythological heroes, and we have this quote from the wonderful courtly controversy of Cupid's coddles and so forth, right? So they really kind of took the project's impetus to situate Pulter, who of course, is easy to think about as someone very separate from her culture, since we only came to her poems quite lately, within that contemporary moments. I'll just show you another example. I really liked the curation for This Soul, That Bird, That Fish. This student, and actually instead of choosing a Renaissance text, added a curation that wanted to draw out the relationship between women and animals, and used feminist theory from another class she was in to situate emblems as a kind of way to push back against this conflation of animality and femininity. So I thought that was a really creative kind of take on that assignment. I'll just quickly show you an example of some quotes from the student reflections that were part of this assignment. This was part of their grade. One student reflected on the novel experience of actually having to make choices about what was going to appear in her edition. And she said, asked about the choices we made while editing and punctuating, and if we thought they were the right choices. I found this to be a rather heavy question. And she goes on to say, when punctuating my piece, I read it out loud about 100 times. And I was like, yes, like, I don't know that I could have gotten my students to do that without this assignment. And she says, I really love this. I had to grapple with the idea that I will not and cannot ever know what might have felt right to Pulter, but the point of this transcription is to bring back the past in a relevant way and not just stick a dinosaur in the 21st century and expect it to thrive. So she uses really creative language to think about the kind of work that we were doing in a way that I don't think that I'd quite ever articulated to them, but they somehow kind of instinctively just understood. Another student, and you can probably tell this is a guy. As it turns out, Pulter's poems are very intricate and laced with references to alchemy, mythology, and history. I really like the ways that he really found Pulter speaking to the kind of more canonical literature that he'd gotten in what seems to have been a very, very rigorous high school education. He says, the vast Leviathan interested me because it seemed almost Melville-esque. Of course, Melville wrote nearly 2 centuries after Pulter, which would make Moby Dick Pulter-esque. And he says she seemed like she would get along with many early 20th century writers. And again, this was not really the point of this assignment from my perspective to get these students to think of Pulter as somehow modern. And yet they ended up doing this work and coming to these conclusions on their own through this process of editing, which I found really exciting. So I'll just end with a few questions that this raised for me. So questions for future courses. I'm always trying to think about how I can improve my classes. One of the questions that really came up for me is Hester Pulter's poetry the best vehicle for Intro to English Literature students to take ownership of a text through practices of research, editing, and curation? And I asked this because I wondered whether I could accomplish similar work by asking students to transcribe, research, and curate a text from our special collections library, which I think would be perhaps a powerful way of doing another piece of this, which is actually bringing them in physical contact with texts from the past, and especially texts that they can visit again and again in a physical way. Another idea I had for this course was, what if we used other writings from the course as the material for curations, so that they would put ideas, forms, and theories from the class into conversation with that special collections item they chose to edit. And I just threw out the idea of calling them conversations rather than curations, just to make it seem less kind of static, right? The object being edited, and more a kind of participant. And then finally, this is something I've actually put into practice. What if we could, in addition to just teaching Pulter and teaching the project in all of these ways that folks have been describing, what about just using the edition curation framework from the Pulter Project in other kinds of classes as a way to practice these essential skills like synthesis, research, transcription, and editing? And I'll just take 1 second before I close here to just very briefly show you what this looked like in my Renaissance class this year. They did all their assignments on a WordPress site, and their last assignment, Disabled Texts, asked them to curate and edit something from our course and put them into conversation. So I'll just quickly show you English Broadside Ballad archive shout out here. A student who thought this was by Peeps, but that's okay. Edited a ballad using the Easy Footnote plugin, and did a great job curating this ballad by talking about the collision of blindness and misogyny that shows up in Renaissance texts. And she curated this ballad with a woodcut, a recipe for an eye cure from a recipe book that we looked at in class, and then this painting of the blind man deceived from the 18th century, where the wife and the boyfriend are right there in the room with him. So I'll just end there. I know this was a lot of material, but I just wanted to throw out some of the ways that the Pulter Project has inspired me in the classroom. in its form, in its genres, and in what I think it's capable of pushing students to unlock in their undergraduate work. So thanks so much for inviting me to take part.
Thanks so much, Diane. Now my mind is reeling with the connections between the first two presentations and the idea of the visual, but I'm going to hold off on that because we have two more. I want to introduce Courtney Pollard, who's going to speak today on the tortoise and the turtle, which I think we've all been primed to think about turtles already, teaching Pulter's emblems within a larger literary tradition.
Awesome, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that there's definitely going to be probably overlaps between all of our talks, most likely. So yeah, so I'd like to start today by really thinking about the question, and quite a simple question, which is just, what is an emblem? Perhaps the simplest definition given by John Manning is that, quote, the emblem consists of three parts: a lemma or motto, a picture, and a following explanatory text, end quote. However, following some of the questions laid out in the introduction of his book, The Emblem, we can quickly see how, we can see how quickly our conception of genre can be complicated. For starters, there's a lot of different literature that uses a similar form, drawing together both text and image. The title, woodcuts, and lengthier written texts of broadside ballads, for instance, might resemble the form of emblems. And yet, we recognize and distinguish these texts as ballads. So on the other hand, Manning and others have shown that there are many emblems that do not conform to this three-part structure. Emblems may have 2, 4, 8, or even more parts to them, and some are even set to music. They're recognizable oftentimes by their picture, and yet even then some emblems lack a visual image, thereby being referred to as naked emblems. Defining them by their thematic content or impetus for use isn't much better, right? The emblems could be devotional, satiric, didactic, political, moral, and the list goes on. So we can quickly see how a genre like the emblem is complex and complicated, but I also would like to contend that it's because of this complexity that the emblem is a rich example for thinking through the concept of genre itself, and especially for how genre existed and operated during the early modern period. Turning to Pulter then, the preface to the Pulter Project refers to the, quote, 54 verses labeled as emblems. By drawing our attention to the labeling and classifying of these verses as emblems, something that was originally done by Pulter and the manuscript scribe, so by drawing our attention to the labeling then, rather than just saying Pulter wrote 54 emblems, the project invites us right from the beginning to think about the difficulties and sometimes contestability that surround the identification and study of emblems. Was this labeling simply an aesthetic choice, or did Pulter worry that her emblems would not be recognized as such, that perhaps hers were not normal emblems? As Manning comes to conclude, asking what is an emblem is not really the best question to ask, because there simply just isn't a normative type. I would like to suggest that it's precisely because there is not a normative type that it could be so important to teach Pulter's emblems within a larger context of literary tradition. On the one hand, teaching the emblems of a single author could be misleading. Since there's such a wide variety, teaching one author's approach to the genre might foreclose for students the many ways in which the genre operates and how it can be used. On the other hand, by teaching Pulter alongside Andrea Alciato or George Wither, for instance, we can gain a better understanding of the ways in which Pulter's particular take on the genre either conforms or departs from what authors have done before. It's through this comparison and context that we can arrive at a richer understanding of Pulter's poetic choices and the implications that they have for her poems as meanings. So for those of us who are interested in teaching Pulter's emblems, I would like to suggest that one good place to start would be Emblem 13, the Porcupine, which we've already talked a lot about a little bit, which I'm excited about. So, this emblem discusses sort of two different responses that the porcupine and the tortoise have when a cart passes by and the men traveling with it begin to laugh upon seeing the two animals. At first glance, I suspect that some people might simply see it as a poem rather than as an emblem, especially because Pulter's emblems lack a picture and they're the so-called naked emblems. However, Victoria Burke, who I think is actually here today, has written a wonderful curation that can help students understand how Pulter engages with the emblem genre and how she draws from popular understandings of these animals. Since one of the main figures in this emblem is a tortoise, Burke draws our attention to Topsell's The History of Serpents, and notes that while the tortoise is typically male in this text, Topsell includes 3 stories in which the tortoise is gendered female. One of these examples is Alciato's Emblem of a Tortoise. Conveniently, the curation provides both an image from the 1615 Spanish edition, as well as 2 English translations, one by Topsell and the other from the Alciato at Glasgow project. Before analyzing Pulter's emblem, it might be useful to have students spend time with Alciato's. The parts of the emblem are more easily distinguishable, which can make it a bit more accessible for students, especially when they begin to sort of explore the different ways in which the parts are working together within the emblem as a whole. They might be struck by the size of the image and how much space it takes up on the page. And we might ask them in what ways the image and text work together to create a coherent meaning, and in what ways the parts resist or challenge each other. And I also won't say too much of this for the sake of time, but George Wither also has an emblem about a tortoise, this one gendered male, that might be fruitful to pair with this curation. And here I will actually go ahead and share my screen real quick. Hopefully you all can see this. There we go. So on the left-hand side is an image taken from the curation, which is the Alciato's emblem. In the middle is George Wither's, and then all the way on the right-hand side is Pulter's. And so we can kind of see at first glance, you know, how the visual image itself sort of breaks up the page, and it makes it a bit easier to kind of see which part is the inscription, which is more of like the lengthier explanatory text. However, when we turn to Pulter's, you know, the lack of a visual image makes it harder perhaps to parse out what those different parts are. And furthermore, that entire emblem is all just one stanza. So it's, again, you know, just the form is just very different, as you can kind of sort of visually see. So then turning to Pulter's emblem, then we might task students with identifying the parts of her emblem, or what could arguably be considered a part. Here I'm thinking of things like looking at the turns in the language of the poem. Rachel Dunn has written about how Pulter makes a devotional turn, which results in a sort of 4th lyrical part of the emblem. And that would be, you know, a great resource to sort of build into this discussion. We might also ask how Pulter crafts a verbal image rather than a visual one. What does the nakedness of the emblem change, does the nakedness of the emblem change the way we read it, or change its potential for meaning? At the same time, thinking about emblems as composite texts need not be limited to form alone. And as we all know, form and content really are hand in hand. It would also be good for us to remember that emblems are derivative. They include recognizable images that are well established within the culture and that are laden with a wide breadth of potential meanings. This is one of the reasons we see the image of the turtle and the tortoise pop up again and again in these emblems. In addition to the porcupine, Pulter has also written 2 others, Emblem 8 and Emblem 47, that focus on the figure of the turtle, gendered female and male respectively. The reworking of the image and the gender of the turtle or tortoise across differently authored emblems gives us readers and scholars a chance to also think about how Pulter's emblems are just one part of a larger tradition. Overall, while the emblems may not always be able to be consistently defined by their form or thematic content, I believe one productive way to think about emblems as a genre, especially for undergraduate students, is to consider the ways in which emblems are read individually and as a body of literature. In particular, the ways that they demand we think about how their different parts fit together, oftentimes in varying ways, in order to create and recreate their meanings. So just to finish up, I'd like to build on our conversation from last week by returning to Vin Nardizzi's call for us to think about the gerund toggling. The composite nature of emblems requires us to toggle between their different parts when we read in a way that encourages nonlinear reading. For instance, when reading Alciato or Wither's emblems, I personally immediately sort of start in the middle at the visual picture. And before moving on to the verbal text, right? And so you can imagine ways that you might sort of like look at the picture and then read the explanation below, and then jump back up into the inscription. Additionally, toggling between different authors, which is sort of greatly enabled by the curations of the Pulter Project, deepens our understanding of not just Pulter as a single author, but also of the rich iconographic landscape of the early modern period. However, there's also a second way that we can understand toggling, thanks to Jessica Rosenberg's comment from last week that illuminated the nautical connotations of the term. Just to remind everyone, or for those who weren't here, toggle can refer to the, quote, short pin passed through a loop or the eye of a rope or a link of a chain to keep it in place. And it also has a potential etymological relation to toggle, meaning to hold fast or entangle. The emblem genre not only encourages us to toggle between its different parts, it also simultaneously asks us how meaning changes when we toggle or hold fast together the different parts of the emblem and how these parts become entangled with each other in the process of meaning making. Toggling as a practice is also what makes the Pulter Project itself such a useful site to teach with, since it enables us to move between, but also bring together. Students can easily toggle or switch between Pulter's emblems, their additions, and the curations. And when we expand the practice of toggling to include these contextualizing materials, the path reading these emblems are expanded. Students, teachers, and readers alike can also toggle or hold fast together the different parts of the site, whether this looks like reading a poem alongside its curation or examining the elemental and amplified additions by pinning them down side by side on the screen. Overall, then toggling gives the reader some amount of control over how they approach both the emblems and the website, and where to begin and in what order to proceed. That ultimately results in the emblem's meaning constantly being, as the title of the Pulter Project suggests, in the making. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Courtney. And now we're going to turn to Marshelle Woodward, who's giving a talk entitled Teaching Early Modern Books of Nature with the Pulter Project.
I should unmute. Okay, so, all right. Okay, so since I wrote the abstract for this talk last April, April 2020, or even maybe a little bit before, I had the great misfortune of being one of the 650,000 US college and university workers to lose their jobs since the start of the pandemic. I lost my tenure track position at Canisius College in Buffalo in a mass layoff that saw the firing of 25 full-time faculty members, all but 3 of whom were actually tenured, some long tenured at the university. I know I'm not the only person actually in this gathering today to lose their full-time academic positions in this manner. And one of my good graduate school friends was simultaneously tenured and laid off this year at Pacific Lutheran University in a mass layoff. So as I was thinking about my talk, I began to sort of consider some of the ways that the crises in higher education and in our broader culture are impinging on our work in the humanities. The majority of these layoffs being very much disproportionately affecting humanities disciplines. And so before I get to books of nature today, I want to think a little bit about this question and how Pulter might be able to help us navigate it, whether inside the classroom or perhaps for some of us now, sadly, outside. Okay. In his well-known 1998 essay, Only Connect, The Goals of a Liberal Education, William Cronin argues that freedom and growth are the, quote, values that lie at the very core of what we mean when we speak of a liberal education, the ultimate aim of which is to, quote, nurture the growth of human talent in the service of human freedom. According to Cronin, both the origin and endpoint of such nurture lie in the Forsterian injunction, only connect. For the skills and dispositions liberal education cultivates create people who, quote, see connections that allow one to make sense of the world and act within it in creative ways. As someone who grew up in relative poverty in a socioeconomically depressed evangelical stranglehold in Western Kentucky, I believe to the depths of my being in the inherent value of liberal education because I've experienced its transformative and liberating effects. But reading Cronin's essay, 23 Years and Several Seismic Political, Cultural, Economic, and Environmental Crises after its composition, I'm struck at times by points that feel overly optimistic, misleading, or incomplete. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where Cronin works, also my graduate school alma mater, undergraduate tuition adjusted for inflation doubled between 1998 and 2021, and out-of-state tuition increased by a whopping 633%. American student loan debt has grown by 76% since the year 2000, as college tuition costs have risen at a rate almost 8 times faster than US wages. To what extent can we say that liberal education proffers freedom under these conditions? How can we claim with Cronin that it serves to nurture the growth of human talent across an individual's lifetime as careers are reduced to gigs and professions like law, journalism, and academia that once fostered the talents of the liberally educated are in varying stages of decline or collapse? Those who have been trained to see connections may be limited in their ability to share them, and many are likely to be denied the social and economic mobility that helps one to get things done in the world, as Cronin says at one point, or act within it in creative ways, like the Renaissance humanist grabbing occasion by the forelock, speaking of emblems, and training circumstances to his advantage. Cronin admits that his essay threatens to over-valorize individual human freedom, and it's perhaps for this reason that the global is almost entirely absent, both in the sense of worldwide human and economic networks and in the sense of the terrestrial or planetary. As we've learned all too well over the past year, connection at this scale poses significant impediments to human agency, as our collective actions redound upon us in ways that are often unpredictable and most certainly uncontrollable at the individual level. This is perhaps a central lesson of the Anthropocene, the grand Marlovian tragedy of our species. Our Faustian actions have proven powerful enough literally to shift the planet's axis. Yes, that was like a news item in the last few weeks. But our connection to the Earth means that we may not survive the changes our masterful knowledge has wrought. Like fortune's wheel, the globe spins out of our grasp with little care for our personal freedom or growth. Which brings me to Hester Pulter, who sadly knew a thing or two about the suffering that may result when the noble freedom of one's mind is unaccompanied by freedom of mobility, and when one's capacity to act within the world is constrained by any number of material, biological, social, or political conditions. Pulter's poetry doesn't provide solutions to the problems I've outlined, but I believe that her notion of involvement provides an essential framework for understanding, being, and coping within a world in which our individual actions often prove ineffectual. As Liza Blake forcefully articulates, involvement is a governing concept of Pulter's poetics and her physics. In her lyrics, to involve or be involved with is variously to envelop or be enveloped, enfold or be enfolded, join with or be joined, and more ambivalently, implicate or be implicated. I emphasize the passive construction of these connotations because, unlike the subject-oriented nature of Cronin's connections, which the liberally educated person sees, makes, or manipulates, involvement for Pulter is a state that is only sometimes voluntary. At its best, to be involved or to involve oneself with another is to participate in an act of creative self-giving that enables new forms and beings to come into shape. Such involvement leaves us vulnerable to grief, injury. To be sundered from that with which we were involved is to at once lose and be left with the self in ways that may permanently diminish us. Even unchosen, involvement also often victimizes us or renders us guilty, just as Pulter had no choice but to be involved with darkness and horrid night on a 24-hour basis, so we're all implicated in pernicious cycles and systems we can't escape. Pulter's lyrics invite us to share in the full range of affective responses involvement elicits, from joy and love to anger, anxiety, and limitless grief. For students today who know better than many of us did at their age that they are acted upon by the world as much or more than they act efficaciously upon it, involvement is a more honest and a more intellectually, emotionally, and ethically valuable pedagogical first principle than one that centers individual agency and the false promise of meritocratic self-actualization. This is nowhere true than in discussions of climate change, which reveal our urgent need to come to grips with our involvement with the world we inhabit. In his remarkable environmental encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes, quote, "We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air and we receive life and refreshment from her waters." This is a lesson Hester Pulter can teach us. And in the time remaining, I want to briefly consider how the Pulter Project might serve as the structural and thematic foundation of an undergraduate course that takes as its starting point the early modern metaphor of the Book of Nature, that universal and public manuscript that lies expansed unto the eyes of all, just like the open access Pulter Project. And I'll be thinking in terms of the integrated course design model, where learning outcomes, course content, learning activities, and evaluation methods are all designed and explicitly framed as mutually reinforcing. One of the most vital resources that early modern literature affords in an age of environmental crisis is its rich diversity of frameworks for conceptualizing and interpreting the natural world. While a text like Bacon's New Atlantis advocates the patriarchal domination of nature that in many ways got us into our current condition, we find in the brilliant pathetic fallacies of Lanier's description of Cookham, the emblematic landscapes of Henry Vaughan, and the dancing atoms and fairies of Cavendish's Poems and Fancies, tantalizing glimpses of environments and epistemologies that might have been. Pulter's poems in particular range dazzlingly across the period's scientific discourses and literary genres pertaining to nature. And the Pulter Project could easily serve as a central textual hub, or to be more Pulterian, like the sun of the course syllabus universe, so that her poems and any available amplifications and curations are featured at either the start or close of units, organized around prominent early modern tropes and genres that defamiliarize nature for the modern reader and unsettle simplistic subject-object divides. So here I'm thinking of the macrocosm, microcosm, emblems and allegory, pastoral, apocalyptic literature, and so on. Those familiar with Pulter know that her poems constantly reflect on how her body and lyrics are implicated at an elemental level with the cycles of nature. She describes her poems as sighs and tears breathed out, textual effluvia that she hopes will catalyze physical and spiritual transformations within herself and her friends, as Sarah Ross has really beautifully illuminated in her reading of The Weeping Wish. And in the poem, The Revolution, she actually tries and fails to purify the globe of Earth itself. In other words, Pulter seeks to involve herself with her reader and the natural world through the matter of her lyrics. And the Pulter Project allows a reciprocal involvement, modeling a collaborative and open-ended interpretive process that students might easily enter into through the creation of a class blog or Pulterian paratext like Diane's Into the Pulterverse, in which they create amplifications and curations of their own, making generous use of contemporary technologies and references in order to consider points of imbrication between past and present. In closing, I would also suggest that students experiment with the early modern hermeneutics they're studying, creating emblems of natural objects they've spent time with, or modern renderings of the human as microcosm to contribute as pages to a class book of nature. Their final entry might perhaps explore climate grief through the genre of consolation, taking as a model poems such as Universal Dissolution or The Hope, in which Pulter finds consolation in her own mortality and the promise of her body's near eternal involvement in nature's symphonic movements of revolution and dissolution. That's it. Let me try to stop screen share here. Stop. Okay, there we go.
Thank you so much, Marshelle.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, every one of you. And now, oh, sorry, Wendy, your turn still. Yes.
Well, I don't have a turn. I was just going to turn it over to Jessica Rosenberg, who is going to kick off our discussion, that which Leah Knight is going to moderate.
Okay, awesome. That's an incredible ending to that foursome, Marshelle. And I've got like 5 pages of notes in front of me, and I'm going to try to filter them into a few concrete questions to get us started. One of the things I was sort of thinking as we were going was, just how productive on a very concrete level the Pulter Project has been in giving us a vocabulary for what we do that's not just reading and editing. And I'm thinking about the language of curation and amplification here, and how much curation extended from the project itself into assignments, into pedagogical work, into the kinds of creative work that students were doing. And Marshelle, I think, coming out of Pulter's own vocabulary, also gave us sort of, with Liza's work in hand, the idea of involvement too. So I think those three are kind of a wonder. I'm finding them a really fruitful trio to start thinking with about the kinds of things we do in the classroom. And I think especially so in the context of, this is a panel that's called Rethinking Genre and Form. And, one of the things I wonder about or one of the things I find very hard to teach about form goes back to something that Andy said, and I think relates to something that Diane said too, sort of through all four of these comments. But that it's very hard to teach form without teaching an idea and then applying it and then looking for it. And I've learned this form and that form, and you get lists of forms, right? You get books of forms, which I think students hate and we hate, and not having that structure is wonderful, but it can also be hard to do. And I think the other hard thing about teaching form is that so often then when we read something, I think both form and genre, we're setting students up to say, here is what's normal, but here's what we're reading because it's special and not normal. So I'm sort of replacing form a little bit with norm there too. And I think part of what all of the pedagogical strategies we heard from all four of these speakers do really beautifully is move away from what is the right answer to this question and the correct application. I was thinking about this with Diane's comment from the student about, am I making the right choices? And then realizing, well, maybe it's not a black and white right or wrong thing, but she went with her gut, she took a risk. So I think replacing that question of sort of correctness or norms with students not quite applying or answering questions, but taking risks in the way that all of the assignments we heard about, I think, have risk at the center of them. And it can be quite hard, I think, to prep students to take those risks, to give them the amount of both scaffolding and bravery. Even if you build them the scaffold, they still have to jump at the end, kind of. I mean that in like a bungee cord way, not in a hanging way. But I think that idea of, I think it goes back to curation and amplification and involvement as forms of creative engagement with form, rather than kind of strict applications of rules about genre or form. So I guess one of the lessons I'm taking away from these papers is the importance of freeing students to make choices in what they do, not simply in trying to find an answer that's right or wrong, but realizing that there is some freedom in how they respond to something. So I think some of the creativity of these assignments that we heard about reflects that, but that there is vulnerability in that too. And I think that also goes back to what Marshelle was saying about involvement and its sort of combination of passivity and activity, that they are acted upon, but they also have some freedom to act. So I was thinking about this freedom during the first three talks, and then kind of wanted to scold myself when you got to Cronin and that idea of freedom, because I think it is that ambivalence that is part of how students engage with form. But I guess the question I just wanted to start with was, how do you kind of free students, empower students to take those risks when you all are teaching these kinds of assignments? Because there's a lot of vulnerability in it, I think. And how do students handle that with each other in the classroom, with themselves? How free do they feel to make those choices? Whether it's collaborative, whether they're doing it solo. So I guess partially, how do you just handle the vulnerability of these kinds of creative engagements with form?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jessica. That's lots of food for thought as we enter into the period of open discussion, in which as we said at the beginning, and if you weren't here, just a reminder that if you want to raise your digital hand at this time, we'll start accumulating a sense of who's going to respond to the respondents, respond to our wonderful speakers. One more hand for the whole crew here for doing such a beautiful job. I think that so much food for thought, so many through lines. And that question, Jessica, I think is really nice, not just for the instructors who are present here today, but also for the students who I hope are present, and I hope will absolutely feel ready to contribute, as Sydney did last day. Hi, Sydney, yes, you're there. Let me see. I might start things off myself with a question, if I may. Come back to Andy, what the heck? Because Andy, I love the creative assignments so much. I get so much joy out of them. And then sometimes the students don't. And so what I wondered, is just in your own experience of this assignment, this graphic narrative, graphic novel, sort of too brief for a novel assignment, is do you encounter resistance when you try to shift the register of the kind of, I guess, the work, the labor that we're asking them to do, maybe not what they signed up for? And then how do you handle that? And maybe do certain resources, just working with certain resources like the Pulter Project versus a textbook, say, does that help you meet and resist that resistance, say, productively for them? Just to start things.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because immediately before this, I was teaching my final class of the semester, and I was asking the students sort of what they wanted to see more of in assignments. And they said that their favorite days in the semester was where I had them write poems, or I had them create a deleted scene to The Talented Mr. Ripley, or things like that, because they felt like a lot of them who struggle, I mean, I assign lots of, you know, traditional critical papers, and a lot of them who get what they're being asked to do, but struggle to write in that argumentative format, really flourish when they can show that actually I do get how a poem works if you let me write one, right? And I can talk about what I'm doing there. And so I think there's a balance, right? I mean, the students who dislike it as much, I was one of those students. I hated the vulnerability of having to be creative. Part of how I ended up in this profession. There's forms and rules. You know, I think those students get served by the other types of traditional assignments. And one thing that I was excited about actually with this assignment was, you know, bringing in comics. It's a form that's very anti-elitist. And I also think poetry, a lot of it also is anti-elitist. And I want students to see that. And the way that they naturally relate to comics, or tend to relate to comics, tends to assume like, this is fun, it's just lines on paper, I'm just gonna do something with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. My hope was that they could transfer that same attitude to the way they think about poetry as well.
Thank you so much. I see Elizabeth Kolkovich. You can feel free to unmute yourself and join the fray. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to all four of you. Those were really fantastic papers. My question builds a little off of Leah's question, which emphasized creativity. I noticed that both Andy and Diane, in your assignments, emphasized collaboration and newness, at least implicitly. And so I was curious to what extent those two things are important to your assignments. So for example, if I had my students do work individually, are they going to get as much out of it as if they worked in partners or groups? And as the Pulter Project develops, how would your assignments look different now? You know, is it important that these are new things? So basically, I'm just trying to replicate your assignments, and I want your advice.
Andy, do you want to start, or should I jump in here? Okay, a couple of things. Thanks for that, Elizabeth. I tend not to mandate collaboration in my classes, although it sounds like it was really fruitful for Andy, so I might have to rethink that a little bit. One really interesting thing that happened in this class was, and this was my first semester teaching at CU, I had a blind student in my class, and there were lots of ways that this didn't present a problem in the way that I thought it would, but that student really did need to work with a partner for this assignment, because transcription, it turns out, which I always like to think of as a really accessible in-class activity, because it assumes no background with or experience in the way that something like identifying poetic form might. transcription turned out to be actually very inaccessible for this student. And I wanted to make sure that she could complete the assignment in a way that felt good to her, through the collaboration and assistance of a partner who helped her do that. So that was something I hadn't really had to think about in my limited teaching experience. And that's something that has kind of continued to shape my pedagogy a little bit. But I would say that newness is something that I actually really make explicit in my course goals now. That a goal in every course that I teach, no matter what the topic is that we're going to try new ways of doing X or Y. And actually on the last day of class, last week in both of my classes, I asked my students to write down something new that they had done in that class, something that they had never tried before. And for a lot of them, it ended up overlapping quite a lot with stuff that they found powerful and enjoyable. And that was stuff like creating a podcast for the first time, editing for the first time. Some students had never acted, in their school experience. There were just all kinds of things that they really resonated with them as being different and pushing their boundaries. So I think for me, when I continue to do a version of this assignment, whether it's with Pulter or whether it's with a text that they can access in our special collections, I really want to make sure that that novelty and that shared experience of novelty is written into the assignment itself. So I think you're right to single that out as something that can be really powerful, especially at the undergraduate level.
Thanks, Diane. Did you want to pick up on any of that? Was it Andy? Andy, are you?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think first of all, emphasizing the things that Diane was talking about to do with newness is a good way of making these kind of jumping to Jessica's question as well, which was about freeing students to take risks. Emphasizing newness is a way that acting, or making the case that what you're doing when you're reading a text is not trying to get to some pre-formed answer, but actually try to do something new with it, which, as I mentioned, is something like obviously the Pulter Project really foregrounds, is a way of taking that pressure off of like, oh, I have to answer to and find the same thing someone else did. In fact, we're trying to do the exact opposite, right? As far as collaboration in the assignment goes, which was part of the question as well, I think it's just, it can be nice to have someone to hide behind and make up for your areas of less strength and then see where your areas of strong contribution are too. So I think that creates a really nice spirit in the classroom that diminishes this sense that you're trying to outdo everyone else, which also relatedly, again, to get to Jessica's question, something that I did that helped students take risk that I recently learned is called labor-based grading. I just learned that's the term for it, but that's what I practiced with most of their assignments in studies and poetry. So essentially, if they turned it in, they got 100%. And I worried, it was an experiment, I worried that maybe they wouldn't try as hard, but it was like some of the best work I'd ever gotten. I would give them like a check plus or a check minus with discursive comments just to like give them a sense of where they fell. And that alone was enough to motivate them. And I think, not being afraid of getting a D or whatever also helped with the risk taking.
Fabulous. Thank you so much to both of you, Andy, Diane, and oh, I see a hand. I see Marshelle's hand. And oh, I should reiterate something we said at the beginning, which is that if, like me, you have trouble operating the little digital hand, you can also maybe throw something in the chat, the question that you'd like someone to bring forward. So that's another option. But in the meantime, Marshelle, can we hear from you?
Fran just took the words out of my mouth. I was about to say low stakes assignments. One of the ways I have tended to teach a lot of students who are like first gen college students or maybe international students, they need a lot of practice with the traditional essay, So while I do some creative major projects like an infographic analysis of Shakespeare, I tend to still keep the traditional essay a lot of times. Sometimes I'll have them argue both sides and be like, you're doing a Renaissance thing, or tell them to complain about to Montaigne for their essay assignments. But I like to do sort of throughout the semester, low stakes, both analytical and creative assignments, and give them to, like when I taught a medieval class, I called their journals commentaries, and their creative, they would do little creative assignments weekly, and I would call them illuminations. They weren't all actual illuminate. Like there was a comic book, doing a comic book translation of Marie de France's Lays. And I would slip up sometimes and say, oh, your journal, and they would, our commentaries, because I like to try to sort of cultivate like pre-modern habits of mind, and in these low stakes, and then also sometimes cumulative semester-long projects. Like right now I'm teaching a course on monstrosity, and each student has a monster that they're researching throughout the semester for our class bestiary, and then they'll do a big cumulative presentation on it. I just had a thought that I've lost. But like many of us have done the commonplace book assignment. So the other thing I like to do is to try to bring together, whenever possible, modern technologies that sort of align. So that was when Tumblr was, the last time I did this assignment was when Tumblr was still really popular. So the students have their commonplace books on Tumblr, and they had to, at the beginning of the semester, we read an excerpt from Dacopia, in which Erasmus talks about commonplace headings. And I had them pick like 5 to 10 hashtags that they were going to follow throughout the semester. So those were the only things that they were sort of reblogging, were through those hashtags. And then at the end of the semester, they picked one that they wanted to write an essay about, and they reblogged them all together so they could see them. And then they wrote an essay that was sort of like commonplacing, and could bring in personal reflections as well. So all of those types of things, I think students, when they're low stakes, they're willing to take risks, and they always comment on them at the end, or even years afterwards. They'll come up and say, that was my favorite assignment I ever did. So those are just a few thoughts.
Fabulous. So much to think about there. Thank you so much, Marshelle. And I see Sam, are you, you've got your hand there?
Yes.
Yeah.
I just want to volunteer students' perspective, opinions here, and I just want to confirm everything that everyone just said from the perspective of a student. The last time that I did any Pulter related materials in class was like 2 years ago in a class with our very own Wendy Wall right here, and I love that class. But I think that back then, like in the class, while like I had access to the Pulter poem and I loved them, I felt like I was still like pretty removed from the materials itself, partly because there were so many references to like outside sources that I couldn't get. And it would take a long time to get to all of them and like try to understand every single one of them. So I really appreciate the curations / conversations that the Pulter Project has available on site. But at the same time, I just felt like after I became like a student assistant for the Pulter Project, and Wendy and Lee are super nice, and they just let me like try my hands on various types of activities, I was able to spend a lot more time with the poems. And I did help out with some editorial aspect of some of the poems, and I felt like those were the poems that I got most. So like, I don't know, I was spending like 3 hours researching plants the other day, because I'm encoding this curation from wonderful Fran Dolan, who's here. But I think that like being exposed to research materials like this in my own time and low stake, like we've been talking a lot about taking risks because the assignments are low stake. For me, this is not really an assignment, but more like, oh, I'm presented this kind of material, and then I can take my own time and research and go down a rabbit hole if I want. That's the kind of interest that fascinate me a little bit more than having to write like a traditional paper. So when I was listening to Diane's talk, I definitely 100% like saw myself in that as a student, just exploring and doing my own annotations and curations of these poems. So as a student, I would like 100% encourage, hopefully, professors to be a little bit more creative with the kind of assignments that you give to the students, especially with these things, especially because Pulter's poetry is new to students. I feel like we don't have the pressure of having to contribute something completely new because not a lot of things has been said about Pulter. So I can be more confident that things that I'm saying are relatively new, and not like repeating something that someone said a couple of times before. So yeah, I hope that all of that makes sense. I love all of the forward talks today, and thank you so much for all of that.
And thank you so much. Thank you, Sam, for all of that. That was great. There is so much food for thought in there. And I'm glad you're happy. I'm glad you're enjoying the work, whether it's in the classroom or outside of it. Yeah, all these new nouns. Last week it was gerunds, and now we've got all these genre nouns, right? Illuminations, Marshelle, and conversations, and it's true, isn't it, that these forms, not just Pulter's forms, but the forms in which we reimagine it and work with it, that shifts what, obviously what we do. I love it. I'm so excited. I actually have a question. Unless there's people, doing and saying things in the chat, and that's great. And like Wendy, I can't cope with that. So if there are things in there that you think you could also bring someone else's idea forward. That's some shy person typing away. You could be that person's advocate. Why not? But in the meantime, but by raising again your digital hand. In the meantime, Courtney, I have a question, and it's not on you to know about an answer to this, but I just wonder if your experience of teaching Pulter's work as you did, right? The emblems, her emblems as an adaptation of a form, with these precedents, it just happens to be these male precedents. Did that lead any of your students, or was there a tendency you had to resist or sort of redirect to treat her work as somehow subordinate, belated, subordinate, lesser? I think you used the word derivative, and of course when you used it, it wasn't a derogatory term. It's just recognizing with, just reckoning with facts. But is that something you need to combat in a culture where, still the idea of artistic originality, and even we were talking about newness, right, just a minute ago, right? And how isn't it neat to do something new? Is there a way in which teaching an author's works, or maybe particularly a female author's works, in that way creates a narrative that you have to resist? I don't know. I just wondered if that was something you experienced.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So I have to admit that I haven't actually taught Pulter's emblems in a sort of discussion based or like seminar. The only time I've taught them so far was actually TAing for Tiffany Worth's class. And I sort of just gave I guess like a mini lecture on the emblem and its form, and sort of introducing students to like the emblem genre as part of like a larger lesson. But I am planning to teach like an introduction to literature class in the fall, and so I'm sort of starting to think about these things, right? And of course getting lots of great ideas, thanks to all of you, for how I might go about doing that. I think part of I think that there's definitely a sort of risk to pairing Pulter with, otherwise like a lot of male authors who are writing emblems, especially because hers are naked emblems. And so I think that they look very different. And I think that they read very differently too. And so I think that there definitely is a risk there. So I would, probably just sort of preface that even though there's people like Alciato or Wither or Quarles who are writing emblems in this way, I guess that's kind of the point I was trying to make, is that there really isn't a normative type. And I think that by teaching Pulter along with a bunch of other different looking emblems, it can kind of reinforce that in some ways. So I guess part of it would be choosing emblems that have variety, because otherwise Pulter's is going to look kind of stark. So I guess in the images I showed, hers did look very different. So I was trying to make a point there, but there's also like a whole bunch of different, right, emblems that don't quite look like Wither's emblems, for instance. And I think that by having that sort of variety, we're able to highlight really, what the emblem genre is kind of about, which is that it's sort of elusive and ambiguous, and that there really isn't kind of like a normative type. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I think that there's definitely a risk, but I think that there's a way to go about sort of teaching it in a way where we sort of highlight that, but then also sort of move away from thinking in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great answer. And I mean, there's highlight it, move away from it, or let them decide, let them dig in and you'll make it a point of controversy, right? That's the other possibility there, because you can flip it too and say that by putting her in that kind of context, it shows how well informed she was, how well read she was, you know, how versed in this tradition and so on. So yeah, there's loads to be said. Oh, and Marshelle has something. Hello, Marshelle.
I just wanted to quickly piggyback off of that and wonderful discussion of students and emblems. When I first taught Pulter in 2015, and I taught Quarles' emblem books, and I had a student who was a digital media arts major, and she came to me at the very end of the next semester, and she had done, I don't think I'm gonna be able, she had done her senior thesis in DMA. She created, I can't do it, she created a modern, it's called Modern Emblems, a modern exploration of the Renaissance emblem book. And I wish I could show you, because she did a cool hourglass skull and wrote a poem that's very Pulter inflected. Wash and clean the robe of skin, a cascade of dust and dirt. She said that it was another one that's like a planet on a string, and she says it's an inversion of the microcosm, macrocosm. It was very cool. So I think students just really like emblems. And that was not prompted by me. So that is all. I wish I could have gotten it to show up a little bit better. But
no, that's great. I mean, it gets us. Thanks, Marshelle. I appreciate it. Multimedia, screen within a screen. Now, oh, I see Diane. How are you doing, Diane?
I just wanted to flag some of the stuff happening in the chat here. Whitney has a couple really good questions, but her most recent one said, how can we think of some of these things we've been talking about and use Pulter in our methods for teaching our poetry to rethink how we teach Shakespeare? And I don't think this is, like, I think this is a really important question, because a lot of us can't decide necessarily what courses we teach, right? And so I don't think Whitney asked that question like to say, oh, the payoff for Pulter has to be Shakespeare, right? The payoff is like, we have to teach Shakespeare. So how can we like bring some of these methods to that? And I just wondered if we could all maybe have a conversation about that. And I also just wanted to say, you know, that this is something I've been thinking about a lot. And I wonder whether the kind of vulnerability piece that Jessica was prompting us to reflect on might be one way of getting at Whitney's question. I was kind of funny as I was participating in this panel. I thought emblems, you know, it's so cool that we're all talking about these, but in some ways they're like the least vulnerable poems in Pulter's canon. And I think that maybe having conversations first about poems like, what's the really long title, made when I was like, I just had my son John and everyone thought I had consumption, and you guys know the one, like talking about poems like that, right? Really give us a chance to think about our vulnerability as embodied beings, in the way that Marshelle's really like reminding us, thinking about our own precarity in all kinds of ways. And I think we really can bring that to Shakespeare and especially to Shakespeare's poetry. And I was just thinking about a video adaptation that one of my students made this semester. They had watched the New York City Sonnets Project kind of as a model. And he made an adaptation of Sonnet 72 by Shakespeare, No Longer Mourn for Me When I Am Dead, that kind of worked through his mom's reaction to his transition from being her daughter to being her son, and the rhetoric of kind of I've lost a child that accompanied that, and just did this really incredible video adaptation reading the sonnet while kind of offering a kind of personal, emblematic in a way commentary. And I think that, you know, that might not be the kind of thing that we associate with the Shakespeare classroom, but I think that teaching Pulter helped me make space for that kind of work and allowed the student to be really vulnerable in that way, in one of the most kind of amazing assignments I've ever seen. So I'd just love to hear more from other people about, and it doesn't have to be about vulnerability necessarily, but just about like how teaching Pulter can change the the way that we interact with our students in other kinds of classes.
Thank you, Diane. And yeah, and Whitney, again, thank you as well. And I really appreciate that voice, that weaving of voices together. Thanks, Diane. And if people want to, I mean, if Whitney wants to get in there, but what I'm going to do, I want to have the conversation too, Diane, but I also want to respect those digital hands. So you remember Diane and remember Whitney and the point. And then I'm going to go to Liza. We can do this. We are very capable. We'll go to Liza and we'll see what she's got on the table here. Hi, Liza.
Hi, I will just say my digital hand deserves no respect, but thank you for according it some anyway. I mean, this is sort of related to that. I apologize for being the one to conjure Shakespeare into existence by saying anti-Shakespeare, so that's my fault. But I am wondering the extent, I mean, partly prompted by the way that Diane, you ended your talk by sort of gesturing out to like, why couldn't I do this with authors other than Pulter, right? Why not go to special collections? And I guess I'm wondering, I'm interested in hearing from all the presenters today, the extent to which your, the sort of pedagogical techniques you're discussing are something particular to Pulter or something sort of particular to what the structure of the Pulter project makes possible, or whether this is, whether these are sort of extrapolatable or exportable. I guess I'm wondering about particularity because it seems to me like, and this is not a bad thing, right? But it seems to me that like the comic books assignment, you could do that with lots of different kinds of poetry in really generative ways. Well, while it also seems like some of the way that Marshelle was thinking about involvement as a concept that might challenge agency and pedagogy, that one does seem sort of generated out of Pulter. So I guess I'm just wondering whether you think what you're doing with Pulter is or is not abstractable.
Thank you, Liza, that's wonderful. And that's for if any one of our speakers would like to take that up, you can just mull, reflect. Yeah. Andy.
It is definitely a very extractable assignment, although for like some of the reasons I talked about, I think Pulter is especially useful. Like what first made me think about it was just the naked emblem, as Courtney put it, that it's these emblems without a picture, and I was like, I could have them add pictures. Is kind of where the idea started, and then that kind of generated into the assignment, which again, I agree is extractable, but I think also some of the, like the fact that the emblem tradition does have this visual centerpiece to it was helpful for getting them to think about the visual side of poetics. So it was a nice like pairing. And then also the Pulter Project specifically, and the way that it emphasizes collaborative production in remaking texts, older texts continually, that was a way of seeing them in producing their own works as kind of part of this process rather than sort of separate from it, working in a classroom responding, right?
Thanks, Andy. Anyone of our other presenters or perhaps other people who were sparked by, I mean, many of us, I mean, at least half of us had taught Pulter. I think it was the last meeting that Wendy ran that wonderful poll, and or half of us were thinking about it. So maybe other people would like to take that up. Or did I see?
Fran had her hand up. Fran,
I saw Fran's hand. Fran hand. Is there a Fran hand in the house? There's a Fran. Hiya.
Well, I had, when I listened to Liza's question, I kind of wanted that to go to the speakers and I wanted them to be able to respond. I was just going to say one thing again about kind of picking up the strand in the chat about the vulnerability when Andy asked us to think about vulnerability in other career phases and genres. And I think one of the ways we can think about that is the kind of ethics and strategy of people who are not early career and are writing letters for job candidates, doing tenure reviews, et cetera, to try to draw attention to the amount of work that goes into the kinds of pedagogy you're all talking about, but also for instance, contributing to the Pulter Project. And last week I made a pitch that we cannot get rid of the peer review if we want to keep including early career scholars and graduate students. But I think one very simple thing is to take very seriously our obligations as the writers of these largely invisible letters, and in terms of educating people in departments, but also outside departments, of how much work, the kinds of work that you're all doing that doesn't necessarily line up with expectations. Talk about genre, you know, you're often being evaluated by people who really don't know that much about what you're doing. And I think it's important to think about how we can try to articulate, explain that, and also to go back to the work, the language of risk, to try to get people to understand this is a scholar who took a risk in terms of the choice of topic. This is somebody who's moving to a second project that's really different from the first project, and to try to value risk, which again, sometimes people outside the humanities are ready to hear. And we need to make that case because they recognize that as something that is important to, say, scientific innovation. So I think there's some opportunities there for us in terms of supporting our more vulnerable colleagues.
Thanks, Fran. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, are there people out there who are just being very, very deferential, perhaps, and they have things that they've been thinking about in the past couple of meetings and they want to bring them forward? It happens. Our students do too. Well, I'm going to come back to a question I had that draws on something that I noticed, which was Diane, in your beautiful, or your students, you and your students' beautiful WordPress site. There was a unity to the aesthetic, right? The thing that framed the entry into the individual poems. And it was these incredibly high resolution and therefore probably really contemporary, probably digital photographs of, close-ups of creatures. And that, of course, is one visual way in and one way to frame Pulter's poems and the focal points of these emblems often are creatures like that. And of course, that's a very different approach visually than what we've taken in the Pulter Project, where I don't know how, maybe some people haven't noticed them, but I really hope you have, that behind the head notes, we have a kind of quiet version of an image, which you can open up and see the whole thing. And generally speaking, we've been drawing on period, usually 17th century, often woodcuts, just partly because it fits the aesthetic of the site or it works, but it's a very different experience and way into the poem, right? And a different kind of visual intertext for the poem than these contemporary photos. And I just wondered about that choice, not just in itself and how you came to it as a class or whether you guided your students, Diane, in that direction, but also sort of opening that up. I wonder, I mean, looking at the names in the list, how many of us here are early modernists, right? And then how many non-early modernists would consider teaching Pulter in their first year class, where they do teach Donne, or they do teach Shakespeare, or they do teach, whatever. How can we break the sort of temporal constraints on who considers Pulter readable and worth foregrounding? And is there a way in which we could do that in how we frame her on the site? Is there something a little too twee about the fact that we frame her with these 17th century images? We could do what you did, Diane. So maybe I could start by hearing a little from you, and then if other people have ideas about that, how to break these temporal bonds. Pulter would want us to, right? So, Diane?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I don't think I have a great answer to this. I use Unsplash a lot in my classes. It's just, I'm sure most of you know what that is, but it's just a photo repository. Probably a lot of your libraries link to it in their research page. And the great thing about it is it's open access. So all the photographers that post there are like, it's okay to use my photo, right? And I do want to emphasize in my class, right, practices of being respectful to, to other people's labor. And so I like to use Unsplash for that reason. And if I went back to the site, you'd probably notice that most of my students actually followed through and downloaded a little link that says, created by, Dan Snivens on Unsplash to show that they didn't just, that image didn't just come out of nowhere. So, you know, I guess this is kind of getting back to some earlier points about like, how did this project end up achieving all these goals that I didn't know I had, right? And one of them being like respecting other people's labor and citing that. But I do think that that is a really interesting conversation that I think a lot of us are starting to have more and more with students is how do the media in which we're having our students share our work and the things that they're pulling from and drawing on, how does that how can we foreground that labor in a way that's ethical, as opposed to just aesthetically pleasing, right? And kind of trying to create a beautiful unified shape. So, you know, that's maybe not the answer you wanted, but I do think that's something that we need to think about more and more as more and more stuff becomes available for our students to play around with, is this question of what is this kind of pulling and citing and compiling labor that a lot of us are interested in mean for flagging not just our own creative and critical work, but being considerate of all the people who've helped us get there, which in some ways is kind of a, I want to go back to Marshelle's wonderful, what was it, cultivating pre-modern habits of mind. In some way, that's like an un-pre-modern habit of mind, maybe Marshelle, but I think we can put it in conversation, right, with that commonplacing trope of like, it doesn't matter where it came from as long as it applies to my situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it also follows from Marcelle's point about these non-innocent terms like involvement. I mean, who can get mad at involvement, right? And yet maybe sometimes a little ex-volvement, a little, is that a thing? No, a little distance is actually, well, that's an option anyways. And other non-innocent terms that I started to reflect on during your talk, Marshelle, that we have adopted and embedded in the Pulter Project, and they're not going anywhere, I don't think, anytime soon, like curations, which have a very, emphatically, that has a kind of elite heritage as a term in certain ways. Even the term amplified edition, with the amplification, the trumpeting, there are issues that could arise from the ways in which we've framed some of the parts of the site in terms of what that says about them, that maybe some people would like to take up. But in the meantime, I would like to hear from Sydney Reeves. Hiya.
Hello. I did want to really, I really appreciated what Diane was saying about photography, and I think it's a hidden form of not exactly plagiarism, but I find that often people don't know where their images come from, and they don't know how to properly cite things. They don't know what is open access and what isn't, because it's so easy to find images and access them on the internet. It's become, we have papers that are behind a paywall, and we seem to understand that, yes, this is something that is owned by someone and I don't have the rights to just take their ideas, but images are very easily accessible. But I thought what would be interesting in that vein was almost to take a kind of photography assignment. I just saw Marshelle in the chat mentioning connecting past and present and opening up that dialogue. I think that asking students to bring forward their own photography could be interesting in that sense in relation to presenting the poems. And I'm not, I've not given incredible thought to this, or it's just come to mind now, but it would be interesting to see how you could connect the world around you and the world that you have access to the poems, because that would be a way to really begin that dialogue of what is actually physically in your area, what can you take pictures of, and bring that in conversation with Pulter's poems. I just thought it'd be an interesting avenue to discover.
That makes me so happy. I love that idea, because everybody's got a little camera in their pocket. Maybe not everybody, but you know what I mean? That's a nifty plan. Okay, that's coming forth in one of the syllabi. You never know. Okay, meantime, thanks, Sydney. And Courtney, what would you like to get in there with? Hiya.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was kind of just thinking about the question of how do we teach Pulter, get other people to teach Pulter who aren't early modernists, right? And where would she necessarily fit in? And I think that, you know, as we've all sort of been discussing, the visual is really central and important, you know, to emblems generally, but also to Pulter. And she, you know, she is a bit unique in the sense that she doesn't have an actual, like, I guess, picture, right? But her emblems nonetheless are very visual, right? She has a lot of really like concrete and complex images that she's working with. And then Sydney, when you were just saying that it's really hard, you know, students, you know, don't necessarily know how to cite, or they're taking images, right, from different websites. It really just sort of reminded me of, I guess, like going back to the genre of emblems themselves, right? And this is kind of what I was hinting at or talking about earlier when I mentioned sort of the derivativeness of them, is that not only are they sort of, you know, or I guess I should say that emblems are building off of one another, right? They're building from this sort of iconography that is, you know, accessible, right, to anyone who's sort of writing in this period, right? Building from common images and the sort of associations with them. And so I think that thinking about emblems in a way, especially the ways in which they are sort of recycling common images and pictures for different uses, is potentially like one way that they might fit into like a larger class on text and image, for instance. And here I'm also thinking about memes. You know, in the way in which that memes are sort of using the same image over and over again, but sometimes with different text, or changing aspects of it over and over again, and this sort of layer on top of one another to create this sort of rich cultural meaning that's sort of, at first glance, if you're not familiar with the picture or kind of the ways in which it's been used, that might sort of elude you. But as you continue to see that image over and over again and worked in different ways, it really does sort of build that sort of rich, I don't know, sort of like, you know, history of meaning, if you will.
Wow, that is rich. Yeah, I like that. I think, and it connects with something Whitney was saying last day about media archaeology as another way, another place for Pulter, way to think about it. And yes, you can go back, you can go forward. I love that the memes as that visual text toggle, that is sort of an interesting comparator for the early modern emblem. Love it. My duties. Megan, hiya Megan, how are you doing?
Hiya. Thank you. I've been relatively silent so far just because I'm like enjoying this so much. But I wanted to respond, Leah, to your challenge to how we might convince the rest of the world to break the bonds between past and present and take up Pulter in their work. And I actually wanted to connect that to Marshelle's lovely, stunning and personal story. And thank you for telling us your story. I appreciate that. To say that I think actually it might take time, right? So our modern colleagues teach John Donne in a survey class because they studied John Donne when they were in college. And there's a kind of generational lag to the pickup of new figures in canonical histories. And that's one, an observation, but two, it actually makes me think that one thing that is really going to be valuable about the Pulter Project is the, and I don't know if you knew you were signing up for this when you started, right? But is the long life of it. So is the sense that it's a project that will remain open and available and vital for instruction now and for and down the line.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that, Megan. It's a long-term thing. It's an investment. Yes. Looking around, doing the smiling and encouraging, counting to 10. Whitney, a non-digital hand. I like those. I noticed those.
It's habit. I don't even know why I did it. I was like simultaneously looking for the hand raise button and raising my actual hand. Yeah, I'm going to second Megan's point that this conversation has been wonderful. And so my chat comments are mostly like, so I remember what I'm thinking as everyone is talking. So that's why I haven't been vocal, but I did want to pick up on this point and conversation also in the sense of the like open access and accessible and free nature of the Pulter Project. I think those are really valuable pieces of it too, because when we talk about vulnerability and access and education, I think, you know, at least I hope we are going to move more and more towards open access resources for students and things that they can read that are more portable, perhaps, than even like a slim volume of poetry these days can sometimes feel. And so I do think that's another important thing to consider as we think about like how the longevity of these practices and how and why certain texts will move forward with us and others might not.
Agreed. And oh, who am I seeing? Sorry, I moved my little finger along. Oh, it's Wendy. Hiya, Wendy.
I've also been silently enjoying, so I like the silence equals enjoyment, and that I can't follow all the things in the chat. But boy, do I have a lot to read about tonight. I just wanted to make one comment and one question. The comment is simply that I've really, these papers today have really helped me think about the different ways the visual can work, both in teaching poetry, teaching emblems, teaching Pulter, but also just in the skills that students have. Like you were just talking in the chat about memes, and my students are so well versed in the idea of the meme and its sophistication, but they had to explain it to me. And once they explained it to me, then I could say, now you understand manuscript coterie exchange. And they then, you know, came back with, yes, now I understand networks. And so there's a kind of a language of visual textual approximation. And I really heard those in the talks, like Andy's talk. I loved the way that the students' familiarity with images helped the process of the anatomization of the poem, the anatomy of the poem. I mean, those assignments really did great dissection, right? And the way that the approximation of a visual panel for couplets, I mean, that showed a really deep understanding of form, and then a real thought about translation into another form. And so for me, kind of all the tropes and generalisms about visual and verbal kind of got new traction from listening to the talks today. And I'm thinking about the Pulterverse as a different set of images, Diane, and the way that the students' framing of that is very different than the graphic novel, but it's the graphic images, but it's a way of translation and juxtaposition that introduce another dimension of visual that I have to kind of be trained to understand that they know, and that helps make this leap that we're talking about temporally, right? I think between why would someone who teaches not in early modern be interested? Well, if these practices are going on in our classrooms, I think my colleagues in other eras are very interested in the students' skills and the way that they do these projects, and that can be a kind of shared way of thinking about it. And I was also interested in like Courtney's idea of visual as kind of juxtaposition, like the idea of all those emblems kind of on the same page is like a different kind of skill. It's like sorting. It's like the Pulter comparison page. So I didn't have any point to that except to say that the word visual got a lot richer for me today when I was thinking about it as a strategy, and then the different skills that went on around it. My question is simply going back to Whitney's point about celebration of longevity. And we have, I know Matt Taylor's on here, and he's one of the people who runs the studio that creates our resources. Will digital sites perpetuate into the future? I mean, what kind of resources do you have to continue these? I don't actually know for sure. So this was a bit of a risk. Talk about vulnerability. I mean, how many hours of our lives, Leah, have we put into this? And you kind of hope that it will be a tool, but I don't really know what the future will be like and whether the server will be there. And I mean, I hope, but I also don't know the realities of that. So I just wanted to throw in that kind of pragmatism of, you know, if you're doing a site in a different media, a project in a different medium, you know, I don't have the knowledge to know how one perpetuates it. And I don't think that's any reason not to do it, because, you know, books go into the library and somebody doesn't check them out for 50 years, you know, that's not that exciting either. But I just kind of wonder about the realities of that longevity.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks a lot. Yes, no, I mean, talk about precarity of a different kind. But Courtney, I do think you had your hand, and I didn't. Did you decide, or what have you got going? Do you want to have us?
I had a different question, so I feel like maybe we can just pause and think about Wendy's question first, and if we have time, we can come back.
All right, I'm pausing, I'm thinking. I'm thinking. You know what I'm thinking? There's something called the Brock hour, and there's also something called the Brock half hour. You know what it means? It means it ends 10 minutes prior so that you can cross campus to get to your next class. And you know what? We all have to cross campus, don't we? Any minute now. That's definitely what I'm going to do. No, I'm going to walk downstairs and eat dinner, or no, make dinner. But so I'm actually thinking, on this cliff edge that Wendy has perched us on, of feeling there is risk, but there is opportunity, and there's a bungee cord apparently, according to Jessica, and she's going to tell us more about how we get tied in safely tomorrow. Let's resume our discussion. Does that sound like a good plan? Let's resume this tomorrow, because we have a lot. Resume, get that? I did that. Because we do have a lot of time for some very practical considerations I hope will come out of the workshop at the end of tomorrow's session, our last session, when I hope you'll join us all again. So again, before we wrap up, I would like to remind you that it's a different start time tomorrow, which is again, 3 p.m. Central Time, if you're in the center of North America, and it goes till 5:30, you know, with the opportunity for a little, maybe go and grab a glass, we can raise a glass to each other. We have our keynote, we have Samantha Snively, who's been our social media and public outreach manager for since the get-go, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the public-facing humanities, public engagement with tools like Pulter Project. We're going to hear from Fran Dolan again a little bit more. We're going to hear her talking about mucking about with a poet in the making before we turn to that workshop, where again I hope to hear more of these voices and ideas. So does that sound like a good plan, Courtney? I don't know if we can bring you back and hear you then. Yeah, all right. Well, then why don't we give our wonderful speakers, thank you, our wonderful respondent, one more round of very silent applause. Silence is enjoyment. I like that. And look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciated this. Take care. I'll just stay.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, you can turn to your mic, say bye. Bye.